So how do you get smooth footage like this instead of juddery footage like this? This is probably one of the most asked questions on the internet by filmmakers, and something that I've personally struggled with in the past, especially pulling older footage into new timelines and videos, or simply not planning ahead, or just rushing a shot without thinking. Now, before we get into this, there's a whole two-part explanation about mixing different frame rates on the same timeline in the Camera Essentials course. So if you haven't watched it yet, I'd pause this video and go watch them first. Now, frame rates are a very controversial topic. Everyone we watch pushes the cinematic Hollywood standard of 24p.
24 frames per second.
Go to your camera settings and change the frame rate to 24 frames per second.
24 frames per second.
24 frames is better, right?
But is this really the best frame rate to use? The issue is that, as we know, Hollywood movies are shot on 24 frames per second, but also they're shown on projectors that can play true 24 frames per second. For the majority of us, we watch our content on our phones, tablets, or on YouTube via a monitor. And this probably has a refresh rate of 60 Hz. So 24 frames per second footage can play natively on these devices. 60p divided by 24 equals 2.5, and that's an odd number of frames. Since 60 Hz rate means the display updates 60 times a second, but the video provides only 24 frames per second. So the system needs to adjust how often each frame is shown to match the display's refresh rate. To adjust for this, it uses something known as a 3:2 pull-down system. Take a look at this. So in the case of a 24 frame video, the video software needs to repeat frames with something known as a 3:2 pull-down pattern. To fit in the 24 frames per second footage into the 60p timeline, each frame on the original video is repeated in a specific pattern to fill in the additional frames. The 3:2 pull-down pattern is applied as follows. The first frame of the video is repeated twice, and the second frame of the video is repeated 3 times. This pattern is repeated for subsequent frames in the video. This sequence results in a total of 5 frames being distributed across every 4 frames of the 60p timeline. Now, this causes a judder or stuttering of the image and the footage that is being played, and this may not be visible in a lot of stationary or push-in shots, for example, but does show itself very noticeably when panning or tilting. YouTube is a classic example for this content, as we watch it on a 60 Hz screen. So you get the pull-down effect automatically, even if your video was shot and placed on a 24p timeline. Watch the trees as we pan across this scene. It helps if you're one of those people that have a 120 Hz screen, such as on the iPhone Pro and iPad Pro models, or on a 120 Hz gaming monitor, as 120 divided by 24 equals 5. So this divides evenly, and that helps with the judder. Here we see that pushing forward is not noticeable, but during the orbit shot, we see the judder is very noticeable, as in the original shot, I made a mistake of shooting in 24 frames per second and placed it later on a 30p timeline. So we see the effect of having to add frames in the timeline. Even having this shot on a 24p timeline has judder when viewed on your monitor. Look at the trees in the background. So what can we do to minimize this judder when we're moving or panning our shots? Well, one of the first things to do is shoot in 30 frames per second and edit your footage in a 30p timeline. This means that each frame will be displayed for 2 screen updates, and the playback will be smooth because you have 60 divided by 30 equals 2. And what about your existing 24p or 25p footage? Is it now useless? Well, no. As long as there's no talking head footage in it, as this distorts the voice, simply do the following. Make a 30p timeline and speed up your footage slightly. So 125% for 24p footage, or 120% for 25p footage. And as I said, you can't do this if you have someone talking to camera,
because the voice will change. So you have to keep that at 100% speed.
Here's a 24 frames per second clip on a 24p timeline. Watch the judder in the trees, and especially when the dark blue building passes by. Now here it is again, this time speeded up to 125% on a 30p timeline. Watch for the tree line and the dark blue building again. And it looks a lot smoother. It's not perfect, but that's what we have. Now, what about cinematic motion blur that 24 frames per second gives us? As I said, a stationary or push-in type shots probably won't show any real judder in 24p footage. And the blur comes from shutter speed alone, not the frame rate. Take a look at this. Motion blur is determined by the shutter speed alone and not the frame rate. If we look at these two shots, we can see that the shot at 24 frames per second and the other at 60 frames per second both have the same shutter speed. And if we pause the video, we can see that the motion blur looks the same, showing that the shutter speed alone affects the blur. So as far as motion blur goes, you can shoot at 30 frames per second and increase the motion blur by having your shutter speed, instead of at 160, which you would for 30 frames per second, that 180-degree shutter rule, place it slower at 1/50, and that gives you a little bit more blur. However, the speed that you pan makes a huge difference to the judder or stutter. The slower the frame rate you shoot in, the slower you need to pan or move the camera to prevent judder in the footage. Now, there's a free resource from Red cameras that you can use. But a good starting point is you should take about 7 to 8 seconds to pan across a normal scene. So here I just went to the Red camera site, and it gives you this little tool for panning speeds. And I just simply Googled what Red camera is full frame, and there's a few of them here. So back over here, we're going to choose a full frame camera, and it's the Red Monstro 8K is full frame, and also the Red Dragon. I just looked for ones that had the full frame format. And then we know the Pocket is 20 millimeters, equivalent to a full frame camera. My frames per second, if I was shooting at 24 frames per second. And then the total panning angle, and I'm going to put down 90 degrees. So this is telling me that if I'm using the 20 millimeter focal length on the Pocket 3, I'm in 24 frames per second, and I'm going to shoot about 90 degrees across my pan. You should do it over 10.5, 11 seconds. So if I go to 30, this is going to take me, or should count to about 9 seconds. So here is a nice little tool just to give you a rough idea. And if we change the total angle down, let's say 45 degrees at 30, we need only 5 seconds. If we're shooting at 24, 6 seconds. So like we said, somewhere between 7 and 8. Just go slower than you think, actually, seems to be the key. But between 7 and 8 sort of is an average, and you should be safe. But it's a nice little handy tool. And this is probably a lot slower than you think. So here's the first shot I did at 24 frames per second. I didn't pay attention to the speed. And we see the judder or stutter in the trees. Here's a few more, this time at 30 frames per second, and trying to count to 8 as I pan across the scene. In this one, we have the same settings as a previous clip, except that we're back at 24 frames per second, and it's moving too fast across the pan, and we see it has a lot of stuttering. Next, we're back at 30 frames per second with a shutter of 1/50, and also paying attention to the speed to keep it pretty steady and slow. Here we see a side-by-side, one at 24 frames per second with the shutter at 1/50, and the other at 30 frames per second, also with the shutter at 1/50 for motion blur. Now, also there are some other considerations. For example, if you shoot at 60 frames per second and put the footage into a 30p timeline, you have to pan for the slower speed, so the 30 frames per second. Again, about 7 or 8 seconds is a good rule. But if you shoot at 60 frames per second and slow it down 50%, it'll use all the 60 frames. It just stretches out the clip for a longer duration. That's something you have to be aware of. Now, shooting at 60 frames per second and putting that into a 24p timeline increases the judder, as it has to throw away 36 frames to fit in the 24p timeline, and it also doesn't divide equally again into each other. So 60 divided by 24 is 2.5. Also, putting 24 frames per second footage into a 30p timeline or a 60p timeline looks bad, as the required frames just aren't available. So panning slow or fast doesn't matter, it'll always result in a judder or stutter when panning. Again, scenes with little motion can work, but panning or tilting will make the judder more obvious. So that's it. I'm guilty also of shooting at 24 frames per second, and then I forget to shoot maybe at a higher frame rate when panning or shooting an orbit scene, only to regret it later on when I get to post. So personally for me now, I try to shoot in 30 frames per second for the reasons mentioned. And when I really want that motion blur, I can set my shutter to 1/50 instead of the traditional 1/60 for 30 frames per second, which in theory gives me more blur. But as we all do, I get rushed in real life and can easily fall back into old habits, or just not think about setting all these little rules and things like that. So don't beat up on yourself. We all do it. So give it a try and see what you think. And remember to slow down those panning and tilting speeds. This will help a lot to remove the judder. Lastly, what happens if you put your 30 frames per second footage into a 24p timeline? Well, this gives you a bad result when panning, as a lot of the frames are thrown away. It especially looks bad if the pan is too fast, shown in these examples. However, what you can do is slow down your footage to 80% speed, and this gives you a decent result. Here's a little cheat sheet of what works while panning at different combinations that might help. And as I said, I now try to shoot and keep my timeline to 30p, and this works perfectly with the monitor's 60 Hz refresh rate. And I hope this makes some sense. Okay, let's move on to the next lesson.